Welcome to App Talk with Upptic, where we dig into the nitty-gritty of how to grow apps and games. We speak with industry experts about specific strategies, tools, and tactics they use to find success, and we keep you up to date with emerging news and trends in the ever-changing games, marketing, and technology ecosystem. My name is Xander Agosta, Director of Marketing at Upptic, and joining me today are my co-host,
Warren Woodward, co-founder of Upptic.
And our guest,
Antonio Garcia-Martinez, doer of various things and writer of a few others.
Yeah, welcome, Antonio. Appreciate you joining us today. You actually came on our radar in a weird way, especially in hindsight. So Antonio got introduced to me from a mutual friend because he's building, he's working on the problem of analytics and attribution for Web3, which is something that Upptic is super deeply researched in. And I'm like, yeah, I got to talk to this guy. And only after the last time that we talked, I saw your name pop up somewhere. And I was like, wait, who's this guy? And I was like, oh, Antonio is a person of some notoriety and has quite a colorful past. So I think maybe this will be a fun interview for you because probably one of the minority of conversations where we're just like, no, we just really want to talk to you about Web3 attribution, and all that stuff in your past is quite interesting. And I'm sure we'll touch on it in certain points, but mostly we're excited about what you're doing now and what you're building with Spindle.
Although I will say I did read Chaos Monkeys in the time from Sunday to today, just because I was like, oh, this is serious.
Cool. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. Cool. One thing to plug at the top, we have our Web3 Games Growth webinar on October 12th at 8:30 a.m. PST. On that panel, we have Jeff Zerlin, co-founder of Axie Infinity, Yusuf Golambas, CTO of Unwoke Brands, and Megan McWilliams, COO of Arrivant. There'll be a registration link in the article, in the blog post and podcast description that go along with this. So please register. Cool. Our first section is Industry Insights, where we do a deep dive on industry news. Warren, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, up first, we have some news that turns out is not actually news, but that's kind of why we want to cover it. So this is a story that we've been seeing going on in a few outlets, all kind of resurfacing the same information. But the headline is Apple allows NFT sales on its App Store, but there's a catch. We're going to link an article from blockworks.co. So for a quick poll quote, tech giant Apple now allows NFTs to be bought and sold through applications listed on its App Store. This enables developers of current apps to sell NFTs in-app and new apps to install NFTs within them. The catch, however, is Apple applies its existing Web2 monetization structure, taking 30% cut from Apple developers who make over 1 million and a 15% cut of those making less. Android's App Store, Google Play applies the same policy. And so here's what's interesting about this. So we saw this story pop up everywhere over the last week, and the source referenced for all of them was just a tweet from Gabe Layden of Limit Break, formerly Machine Zone, and that was kind of the only source referenced in all this. So and Gabe had made some announcement or tweeted about Apple now supports NFTs. So we actually did some research. We reached out to some contacts we have at the App Store. Nothing has changed. This is not some new policy. There's not official announcements. This is just the thing that flagged this was Vessel, the new product from AppLovin that's selling NFTs that we covered last week. But basically, people just assumed that because this is out there, that there's some new policy. That's what Gabe assumed, I think. So yeah, there's not actually any news here. This is just a story of someone figuring out how to launch a NFT selling app within Apple's current kind of difficult to navigate framework. So yeah, what do you guys think about this situation? And I don't know, so sort of the short-term path that we're learning about how Web3 and NFT apps can exist in the Apple ecosystem.
Dude, Warren, I mean, there was a tweet, so there's news, right? I mean, tweets used to reflect news. Tweets now are the news. So the fact that Gabe Layden tweeted a thing, that is the story.
There we go.
There we go.
It is truth.
I mean, whether or not something actually changed, it is kind of weird, right? Like this business of Apple's take rate of 30%, you see it everywhere. Like, for example, the great mystery of why you can't buy Kindle, editions of books on the Amazon app, it's precisely because they would have to take 30% of the business. And so you actually have to do it through web, which is like the clunkiest, like one of the things that drives me crazy, not that this is not group therapy, but it's like when there's an obvious battle between FAANG companies and they therefore screw up the product somehow, right? Like, for example, another thing you've noticed, I'm sure, the Amazon your order got delivered email is the most generic thing ever, and they never show the product. Why is that?
Right.
Because they're worried that Google's actually going to scrape the data and then create user profiles, run it. So you create this horrible user experience where like you get the email and you're like, I don't know what arrived at home. Who knows? Is it like the super valuable thing that I have to go get right now, or is it the dog food? And you don't know, right? And it's just like one of these places
That makes
where,
so much sense.
Yeah, I
I
never-
mean, it
I
doesn't
never
make
thought
any
of the
sense at
Amazon
all,
one.
but it makes sense in that war between
right.
the titans.
So we poor consumers are like the little ants scrambling between the legs of the elephants, and sometimes you get crushed. And this is one of those examples where it's like, I mean, what more Web2 model is there? What drives Chris Dixon more into a froth than the fact that the 30% take rate on the Apple App Store, right? And so it just seems to me that at least spiritually, it's very antithetical to sort of the Web3 ethos.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we see sort of like the brute force tactic. We touched on this last week, but basically what AppLovin did with Vessel is they just sell you 70 cents of their token for $1, and that's what you get, and they just pass that cost on directly onto the user. It's both brilliant in its simplicity and kind of brutal.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is going to be like, so if you were to, but it's going to be, it's still going to screw the consumer, because if you're going to buy secondary market,
right,
like NFT, you basically can't, because Apple has to cannibalize that in some way. And so, yeah, it's not gonna be a good look. Basically, what's happening is these companies are making tradable assets, because Apple, if you were to do a transaction, it has to be an IIP, and then Apple has to take a take, which is greatly larger than the take that the companies who actually produce the NFTs are going to create. So I don't know. It's not. Yeah, it's obviously not a good user experience.
At the same time, I mean, to some degree, the products both of our companies are building have a dependency on eventually Apple and Google playing nice with the Web3 ecosystem. And at least this gives us a hint of like a possible path forward. And I think we just build from here, like the Apple's policy is not going to change overnight, but at least now developers have a framework they can reference and say, that's okay. I can at least do things that way. Is that appealing? Is that going to be a viable business strategy? We'll see.
I mean, the bomb throwing radical approach here is that actually crypto needs to build a phone. that's the
They're
other
doing
approach.
it. Polygon's building one. I am very skeptical.
Well, they're announcing it. And the Solana phone as well. Yeah.
Oh, is that what it is? A Solana phone? Yeah.
Well, there's both. There's
a few, I might have missed one, but yeah, I mean, didn't like Facebook try this? Amazon tried this. I'm very skeptical that this is going to work. Like, people like their iPhones. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was at Facebook when that happened. It was basically just a skin on like a Samsung phone or something. It wasn't really a phone.
Yeah.
That said, I mean, this has been reported, so it's not leaking. But Facebook has thought more seriously about building a phone in the past, and in fact had a project for a while. And Zuck's intuition there was actually ultimately correct, as we're seeing with ATT. At the end of the day, for as titanic and imperial as Facebook is, it's just one more app in an app store from the point of view of Apple.
Right.
And ultimately, when it comes to ATT, which is, I mean, something near and dear to my heart, which is attribution. And attribution, you critically need a primary key that joins all the experiences for users across all the platforms.
Right.
And if you take that away, it's like taking running water away from a city. Like, it all just breaks down. Like, you can no longer have the ecosystem you had before, which is what's happening. And so in some sense, Zuck's fears, or those who would want to build a crypto phone's fears, are not unsubstantiated by history.
I think you're totally right. I think the issue is that the pain is not felt by the consumer, right? It's felt by the developers, and for that reason, the consumers aren't going to switch unless there's some like really compelling value prop. Okay, let's keep moving. The next article is Robinhood is a TechCrunch article entitled "Robinhood debuts non-custodial crypto wallet on Polygon to 10K beta users." Here's a quote: "Robinhood is finally rolling out a beta version of its non-custodial crypto wallet to 10,000 customers on its waitlist after its announcement of the product in May. The company revealed it will launch with Polygon, a popular layer 2 blockchain that plugs into Ethereum and makes the network faster and cheaper. Notably, Robinhood says it won't charge Robinhood wallet users network or gas fees for transactions, differentiating its non-custodial offering from other popular non-custodial wallets such as MetaMask or Coinbase." So this is really interesting. I think it's super smart. Users like me already have a pretty strong relationship with Robinhood. I use them for buying crypto and obviously stocks as well. Although, I mean, there's some issues with them. But I basically, if I'm going to buy some Ethereum, I buy it through Robinhood and transfer it to another wallet. They want to shore up that relationship and own more of the experience. However, the free service is like an interesting one, because like obviously that's their business model. But who's paying for the order flow in this case, right? Like, is this an acquisition? Is this just like a user growth strategy and they're going to eventually ratchet this on? Or like someone, like the whole point of that free stocks was that someone is paying them for it. Like, who's paying for the order flow in this situation is my question.
Well, I think you just touched on it, which this is like a new customer onboarding strategy.
Right.
You know, they, in the same way that giving away a free stock is a loss leader to bring in a new user to the ecosystem. I mean, this sounds great on paper, but like a Polygon transaction is, you know, typically pennies or fractions of pennies. And so you can give away a year or more potentially of Polygon transactions for that value of that free stock potentially for an average user. I don't know, Antonio, this is all pretty close to the space you work in. What do you think about this move?
Yeah, I mean, full disclosure, Polygon's an investor in my company. So I think it's funny. Somebody posted the link that you shared in my company Slack, and I like joke replied, "Oh, what are they going to do? Make it free and then like charge the L1 or something, or get like an order flow?" And actually, that's kind of what's going on.
It's brilliant.
I think it's great. I mean, look, what I find interesting about Web3 is that what you would consider to be kind of an infrastructure tier, which is the L2, cares about its users, right? Like they care about their DAUs in a way that I'm sure, you know, AWS, it cares about usage, but it doesn't actually care about like the end users actually using the underlying infrastructure. But that's not true. Web3 actually punches through the abstraction layer. And I'm sure a company like Polygon cares about its DAUs or its DTUs, or however you would define it in Web3. So you know, I think it's a brilliant strategy. I think it's probably a great move. Yeah.
The other reason I really like this, so like, you know, almost all of my blockchain transactions are all around gaming, and a lot of the games are on Polygon, obviously, and they use a lot of transactions. So even though the transactions are very cheap, it is still something you have to like allocate for and make sure that you have enough, you know, Matic in your wallet. You know, like I played a game for 45 minutes last night and maybe made 15 transactions. Like that adds up pretty quick. So I think for anyone who is deep in Web3 gaming on Polygon, it's a huge value proposition. You just never even have to worry about that budget for your transactions. My
Ether orc is sitting on connected to the ecosystem for exactly this reason, because I was like, this is just a pain in the ass. I'm not going to do it. So it's still sitting there. And if I had the wallet, it would be fixed.
Nice. Well, why don't we go on to the next article? This one is from Bloomberg. This one just popped on our radar this morning. But I think it'll be a fun one to talk about. And the headline is "Podcasters are buying millions of listeners through mobile game ads." This was something that honestly wasn't on my radar, and I feel like should have been. So there's a research firm called DeepSea that focuses on ad fraud, and they did this new report. And for a little info on this, podcast networks are actively mining downloads in the mobile game space, doing so through an intermediary company called June Group. Each time a player taps on one of these fleeting in-game ads and wins some virtual loot for doing so, a podcast episode begins downloading on their device. The podcast company can in turn claim the gamer as a new listener to its program and add another coveted download to its overall tally. So like basically, the flow here is, and the example they give is with Subway Surfers, which is massive casual mobile game, kind of notorious for providing, if you're deep in the UA weeds like us, it's one of the earlier things you do when launching any game is you block traffic from Subway Surfers, because it's just, not that it's a bad product, but it usually has a lower quality, like average monetizing user. So the flow here is someone sees an ad in the game they're playing, or they get offered some gold or something for viewing the ad. They click on it and a podcast auto loads and starts downloading and playing. As soon as it happens, the ad is served within the podcast, so pumping up the numbers of ad impressions for someone buying in that other podcast. And it's just this kind of complex, like greater fool theory of someone is buying this low quality game inventory and then using it to pump up their podcast numbers. And then what this research paper found was they're basically using those inflated numbers to sell to brand advertisers and say, we have this many users. So that's kind of the whole thing uncovered by this. Guys, have you been following the story, like with thoughts on this tactic?
New growth strategy for App Talk with Upptic. Let's do it.
Yeah, it's wild. As a side note, I think the podcast audio ad space is fascinating. I'm actually an advisor to a small podcast audio ads company, and just talking to the CEO about how that world works, like you actually have just-in-time audio ad serving, you have programmatic ads targeting, you have like, you're starting to get all the sophistication of like Web2 ads in an audio format. Like you actually have voice synthesizers that actually read out the voice in a certain voice that performs better or worse, because paying for a host rate ad, that's like the premium inventory versus the remnant. You have back population of the podcast. Yeah, you have all this shit going on that's just incredible. And so I'm not surprised that if you create this level of technical sophistication, then the fraudsters and criminals will also reach that level of technical sophistication. So I'm not surprised at all that this is because, you know, podcast CPMs can be shockingly high. They can be as like $30, $40, $50 CPMs for some of the top podcasts, which is a lot.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up CPMs. One thing I didn't write down, but was called out in this article, is they are buying Subway Surfers. Well, the example given, I don't know if this is fact. They're buying Subway Surfers ad inventory for $27 CPMs, which for a casual mobile game, that is insane.
High,
so they're like grossly overpaying for this inventory. So there's
like
like
a strategy.
There's a rake being had at multiple levels with this.
I guess the brand marketers are probably just drastically overpaying, because that seems crazy that you could sustain a $27 eCPM on Subway Surfer. I mean, we were paying like single digits and being unhappy about it. Okay, we'll jump quickly to our next article, which Warren wanted to cover, and I'm gonna read quickly from. It's entitled, it says a Walmart blog article. Walmart jumps into Roblox with the launch of Walmart Land and Walmart's Universe of Play. Here's a small quote. Today, Walmart is announcing the launch of 2 immersive experiences in the metaverse mega platform Roblox, Walmart Land and Walmart's Universe of Play. Spaces offer unique interactive content, entertainment for customers, and bringing to life the best of Walmart's aisles and virtual worlds. And all I have to say is, oh my God, this is the most horrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. Not only does nobody want any of Walmart in the metaverse, but like they're targeting Roblox, which is aimed at children. So they're trying to brainwash children into thinking Walmart is a good thing. What the fuck?
I assume, Xander, do you have children yourself?
I do not.
Oh, okay. Because usually people who don't have children don't know what Roblox is. But if you have children, you definitely know what Roblox is. And you have spent many a long hour inside various games, as I have with my children playing.
Can I interest you in Walmart Land?
No. I would pay not to go to Walmart Land, and then the metaverse is what I would pay for.
Yeah, I feel like when I want to step into the metaverse, I want an escape from the dark realities of everyday life, and nowhere is that weight heavier than walking into a Walmart. Like that is the last feeling that I want to take with me into the metaverse.
But perhaps more importantly, is this a bullish or a bearish signal for the metaverse? The fact that Walmart's in it.
I mean, ultimately bullish, right? I mean, it's like it's at least being investigated and invested in some way.
Right.
Yeah, the question, I think you'd have to define, how do you define metaverse in this context? I mean, I'm like of the camp that Facebook and Instagram is the metaverse, so it already exists, but like, and so is Discord, and so is all these video games people, since so is Second Life, you know, like it's been around for forever. But I don't know, no one wants this. Anyway, let's jump forward to our main segment. We'll be talking about Web3 marketing attribution. Got a very good guest with us, and so I'm really excited to do a deep dive with Antonio. Just kicking off, Antonio, will you tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and then spin from that to what Spindle is?
Sure. Man, where to begin? So yeah, I've had a little bit of a varied path. You know, originally I dropped out of a PhD in physics at Berkeley. And as many labs physicists, I went into finance. And so I was pricing credit derivatives for Goldman Sachs during the prime years of 2007, 2008, when the credit crash was happening. So off I went from bohemian kid with like, you know, with like a ponytail to having some trader standing over me yelling with a baseball bat in his hand saying, "Where's the risk report?" That was exciting to watch. Then I came back to tech. And so I joined an ad tech company in 2008 or 9 or so. And that was my first dip into the ad tech world. And I've been there basically for 10, 12 years. And for those who don't have video, my cat just jumped on the table. And so, you know, since then I've been basically at every size and scale of the ad tech edifice, buy side, sell side, tiny YC company, pre-IPO Facebook, been, you know, basically turning data and human eyeballs into money in various forms, to put it quite bluntly. And more recently, I wrote a book about it called Chaos Monkeys, which is kind of a memoir of my time going through the startup cycle on Facebook. I've written for Wired, the Washington Post. I was like a journalist for 3-4 years. You know, I have a blue check, all that stuff. It drives me crazy, basically. I'm not really a narcissist. I just play on the internet. I'm not particularly good at it. I'll leave it to the other big names on Substack to be better narcissists than I am. And so I've come back to building. And what I'm building is in Web3. And I basically asked myself 2 questions. One, what in Web2 could legitimately be rebuilt on blockchain lines? Like what should actually be on the blockchain? There aren't many things, to be honest, but there are quite a few. And then what is like totally missing from Web3, right? And the answer to both was basically both attribution at its most fundamental level, and then eventually like some form of measurable user acquisition that kind of works. You can call it ads. I just like using the word ads because people in Web3 kind of recoil. My answer to that is like, hate to break it to you, NFT drops are ads, right? you don't call them that, and it's kind of weird. An ad isn't just the skeuomorphic little 300 by 250 like block of pixels. It's all sorts of things, right? That's all forms of marketing, and Web3 will absolutely have them. They are, already does. And so, I asked myself, okay, how's this ecosystem going to unfold? Because I've seen two ecosystems unfold: the desktop ecosystem that I was a part of at Facebook, and then the mobile app install ecosystem, which was evolved kind of separately after the fact. And they both converge to kind of the same thing, kind of siloed gardens within companies like Facebook and Twitter, and then a slightly more open ecosystem in the case of Google, in which it's a little bit more modular or composable, as you would say in Web3, and that you can use this ad server with that buying platform, which is talking to that publisher tool, right? It's not quite as modular and Lego-like as I'm describing, of course, because Google's always kind of present. But I thought, how is this ecosystem going to evolve? What do we need to build? And then I just started talking to companies, right? So I talked, Warren, you and I have had a conversation. I talked to, companies, Mythical Games, Axie, et cetera. And it's like, what are your CACs? What are your retention curves? What's the, and like, the answer is like, occasionally, not the companies that I just mentioned, but other companies are like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? What do those things mean? And I'm like, oh my God. And then sometimes it's like, no, we know what they are. We just have no way of measuring them. We don't know.
Yeah, it's not that these aren't brilliant teams.
Right.
It's just like there's no infrastructure.
There's no infrastructure.
Yeah.
They can't answer the question. And I was just like gobsmacked. I'm like, I don't understand. There's like billions of dollars of liquidity running through some of these ecosystems. They are not poor. They're very smart. How are we like banging rocks together in this new age? I'm like, I got to fix this. And so the company is called Spindle without the E, because I cheaped out. I didn't want to pay $50,000 for Spindle with the E. So we dropped the
Upptic with
E.
2 P's. Let's go.
That's how we got the Upptic name too.
I was about to say, we sound like a sort of West German metal band from the 90s or something is what we sound like now. Actually, I almost want to put the umlaut on there for like the Motorhead effect. But so it's Spindle without the E. And there's several stages to the company. I don't want to turn this into a total sales pitch, but the short version is analytics and attribution. Like there's a marketing funnel to everything in life, right? And you're top of funnel, whether it be a highway billboard or a Discord post or a Facebook ad. And at some point you go into the funnel, you're in the experience, you're a customer, you start spending money. You have to measure all across that in some form or another. And what's interesting, and I'm sure Warren, you've probably discovered this having straddled both worlds, is that the web, certain high level concepts will be analogous in Web3 and Web2. Like everything has a marketing funnel. There's obviously a marketing funnel inside Web3,
right?
But other parts of it, Web3 is like the reverse in like strange ways that at first you don't realize. So for starters, like attribution modeling, to get a little wonky on Web2, is pretty simple. You bought a thing, right? You go to REI and you bought the $100 thing. That's it. All the complexity is like in the ad serving, the ad ranking, the targeting, all the stuff going inside your Instagram feed, like all the complexity is there. The attribution is actually pretty simple. You just have to be clean about it and consistent about it, and you measure things. Web3, it's the reverse, right? It seems like it would be easy because it's all on chain, but it's actually super complicated, right? If you ask the question, like, how much money could an exchange make off a user? Like, what is the LTV for that? It's a very difficult question to answer, actually. Right. Even though the data is there, the data tooling is really poor. And so you have to like muddle through a lot of not great infrastructure to get the answer. But even leaving that aside, even assuming you have SQL queries that run, asking that question is very difficult. And so a lot of what we're doing is like, okay, what is the equivalent of like the conversion pixel in Web3? Well, it's a smart contract with a function that you called, where this is the from address on the wallet address. That defines a thing. That is the final point of the entire funnel. And so everything you measure in the funnel has to get measured against that. And that's your thing. And it doesn't require any instrumentation on the part of the developer. Of course, it's public because it's on chain, but still getting to it is still very difficult. And so those are some of the challenges that we're facing now.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we learned about what you're building, it super spoke to our team. A lot of our work at Upptic and in the products and tech we work on is like, okay, cool. There's a lot of piping around for measuring different parts of marketing ecosystems, but it doesn't all talk to each other well. And a lot of times, if you're not in the trenches, like a user acquisition practitioner, it's really hard to kind of gain insights from that. So a lot of our work is like taking these pieces of disparate piping, joining them and providing like clear, easy to understand like insights and data modeling on top of that and automation. But when we started going into Web3, we realized a lot of the same things that you're talking about. We would talk to some of the smartest teams and most successful companies in the space, like, cool, what's your LTV? We have no idea. And when you start looking at it, it makes a lot of sense, like why it's so difficult to measure. You have like, you spoke to just the complexities of Web3 native economies, but a lot of the early successes are going to be actually these hybrid economies where it's not only all those things you talked about, but there's also like, we're getting ready to launch Axie Origins. That's also eventually going to have like traditional in-app purchase. Maybe some of these games will have ad revenue as well. Right. And then you have marketplace fees that it's like me buying something from Antonio. It's not me buying something directly from the developer. And it quickly is this complex stew. And how can we, that this is when the pipes don't even exist to pull in those key pieces of data, how can you boil that down to a number that an executive can look at and say, I spent $1 and I got $1.10 back, which is really the question that performance marketing at least is always trying to answer.
Yeah, and I think you're putting your finger on one important thing, Warren, right? We're not, as it is, Web2 and Web3 live somewhat siloed, certainly from an attribution perspective, because there's almost no way to track identity across them. But going forward, as Web3 gains more and more adoption, Web2 and Web3 are going to blur together in weird ways, right? Like right now, like signing with a wallet is a super heavyweight process. You have a favorite chain. It's very wonky and technical. I suspect if we get any sort of mainstream consumer adoption at all, people will move very seamless. Like people are going to log in with a wallet, like they log in with Google, like SSO and like some service somewhere. It's going to be a relatively seamless experience in which identity is managed. It might not even be custodial in that they don't even know that they have private keys. They go and do a thing, and then they come out of a Web3 experience into a Web2 experience and go back in. And you have to create some sort of identity layer that spans those two so you can make sense of the complete user. Like this user clicked into this Discord post, clicked into this tweet, saw this ad, they came in and did a thing, and somehow we can tie all that together. Because otherwise you're using the force, so to speak. You're flying totally blind when it comes to user acquisition.
So I guess if we want to focus this context, at least the initial part of this conversation on analytics, what in attribution, like how does Web3 evolve when we have good attribution, right? Like, is this something that's going to be net good for consumers? I mean, like, obviously we can look back the last 10 years and say, hey, we built this Web2 ecosystem. It allowed hyper targeting for a long time. We were allowed to make all these free to play games. It did a lot of good stuff, or, some people did well. We ended up siphoning off a lot of attention. We discussed whether or not that's a good idea. But like, one of the nice things about the Web3 is it's being at least billed as sort of a hard reset, at least a soft reset. Yeah. What is the implication of creating attribution and analytics and all the downstream effects that come with bringing that into Web3? I guess let's start there.
I mean, ultimately, I believe in the Web3 vision. Like part of what is I find interesting in Web3, and like my take on the whole is crypto an actual improvement on Web2 sort of debate, which is still kind of ongoing. I got into this one. I still occasionally get into these debates. From my perspective, if we create a new internet in which what are the existing, behemoths, the FANG companies, variously defined, kind of don't exist or allowed, other startups to actually grow other than in their shadow, right? Like I used to live in the Pacific Northwest, and a tree canopy looks amazing, but it's actually very stifling to younger trees because they actually can't get sunlight. So you have these enormous trees. So in fact, knocking down trees and actually opening some sunlight can often be good for the forest for many ways. And I feel like that's kind of what we're doing. Web3 is an open field without the tall, shady trees that basically crush all growth that's smaller than the tallest trees. And like, even if at the end of the day, consumer Web3 doesn't look that different than Web2 in the sense that, well, you sign into a thing, you have an enjoyable experience, you engage in some economy, and then you go off to do another thing. Like at the end of the day, I think it's not going to look that different, Web3 to Web2. The fact that it's not the same 5 companies, or it's that Apple taking a 30% rake just because, right? Like to me, that's already success.
Right.
Right. And that's why I'm involved in it, because like, I'm tired. Like, what are you going to do? Put another service on the same mobile app to like buy another thing? Like we've been doing this for 10 years. Like Web2 doesn't have the excitement that it used to have. Right. And that like the smartest people who are at the edges of like the known world technically,
right,
to be blunt, are in Web3. They just are. And that's where we are. So that's why.
That's something that we talk about all the time, which is like that it's part of why, besides like being, drinking the Kool-Aid myself, like for a bit here, it's just so screaming obvious that like look at the massive brain drain from all of the FANG companies, from all of the legacy gaming companies into Web3, and then look where the funding has gone. Like, maybe the products are not there today, but what do you think is going to happen? Like, when all of the smartest people and all of the money moves to this segment, and so like when we started going hard into Web3 as a marketing org, we would we try to do a webinar, and we'd reach out to like all of the people that normally sponsor webinars, the big ad networks, and like existing attribution providers, and they're just like, yeah, we're not interested. That's not really a market opportunity for us. And then 6 months later, like they all have their Web3 initiatives, and like, yeah, we love Web3. So it's just so obvious that the infrastructure is needed, but I think like people really need it, like beating them over the head for the existing those existing landowners, like the canopies, as you put it, to move from like a defensive position. They actually need to see that their current market is at threat from some of these new up and comers. But that's why it's exciting to work in the space right now.
Yeah, I mean, I tweeted literally that, right? If all the smart people and all the money are running in one direction, like it or not, something's going to come out of that, right? Because again, like you and I have been around long enough to remember what it was like in 2009 or 10 in tech, right? Like, by the way, companies like Uber and Airbnb had lots of doubters back then too, right? And it wasn't obvious that they'd be so amazing and they would take off in so many ways. It was like the first consumer use case that started taking off. It's like, oh shit, this is kind of interesting. It's funny, I had this debate with Max Levchin on Twitter, and I like Max. I've interviewed him for my podcast. He's a very smart guy. And, I think he had a correct comment, which is like, you're right. PayPal had a terrible use case early on. Like PayPal actually floundered for a long time. And then it almost accidentally discovered its key use case, which was obviously, as everyone knows now, if you read the history, PayPal was serving as a payment layer for eBay. Right. And eBay itself was weird. It's like, who's going to trade figurines? It's like, no, dude, it's not figurines. It's like everything, right? It's everything used you can buy on eBay. And then, by the way, we need e-money to pay for this online auction. And suddenly PayPal grew. And that's, the problem is we haven't found the eBay yet, or we found small versions of eBays, but we haven't found like the macro eBay that's going to make everyone flip over to the Web3 side and say, oh yeah, of course. This was destined to succeed from the very beginning, when in fact, we've been through like years of hate and skepticism. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, games is like the real first use case where you're seeing actually massive adoption, and games tends to be on the cutting edge of basically all technological adoption. So basically wherever, I mean, this is a very biased opinion, but basically wherever I see games, technology and infrastructure going, I assume that the rest of the world will follow suit eventually.
I mean, to be blunt, it's games, porn, and crime. I mean, those are the top three early adopters, which there's plenty of in crypto. Well, I guess not porn, but and the reason why I say it flippantly, but it's true, right? These are people like in the gaming space, well, this audience would know, but they're very results oriented, right? They're very LTV focused. They're very quantitative, right? Which is why in Web2, they drove the progress of programmatic ad tech in a huge way, right? And so, I mean, obviously, I'm literally talking my book here in the sense that like Spindle is going to bet big on working with gaming companies, because I think when it comes to quantitative attribution, they're obviously the earliest adopters. So.
I think another reason it makes a lot of sense to build a business for a product like Spindle around gaming is there's going to be a lot of products that rhyme with each other. It's part of why our team doubled down on gaming. Earlier on, we would also focus on growing some non-gaming apps, but it was kind of like starting from zero each time. If you have like a one of one style app, but gaming, it's just this massive sector of, there's a lot of iteration. A lot of iteration and small innovations, but it all kind of rhymes with each other. If you launch 50 games, like you're going to get tactics from each of those that inform and improve how well you can do the next one. And I think it's the same thing if you interview 50 game companies, what are their need set? It's going to be like a massive amount of overlap.
Yeah, I mean, even technically, like, so the way we're doing product dev, which is both one of the fun parts and also challenges of like kind of inventing a little bit a new field within an industry, which is like, how does Web3 attribution work? We've been doing a series of case studies. So half our employees are data scientists. So we're digging into like the Polygon ecosystem. And the cool thing about, again, Web3 is that there's all this data that's public, right? And so you can go to Zrun, which is like a horse racing game in Polygon, and look at all their data, right? It's public, right? You can just look at it and say, look, isn't this interesting, right? Like the LTV of users who come from here or buy their NFTs there is higher than somewhere else. But then you need to do that to model the game dynamics correctly. But then you start realizing exactly what you just said. Things start rhyming. It's like, okay, if there's an NFT involved, then actually there's a small set of smart contracts and a small set of NFT marketplaces. That's actually where all the money flows through, right? So those are basically the three sort of sources of revenue in this company. And you can start productizing what it looks like a very bespoke case study into an actual like dashboard that every game developer can just load and say, aha, here we are, right? So, yeah.
Antonio, one thing I'm thinking about as you're, talking about your plan with Spindle, what do you anticipate the moves will be from some of the existing measurement providers in both mobile and traditional like web measurement as well? Like, are you worried about moves from like AppsFlyer, Branch, and anyone like that?
Yeah, I mean, I work for Branch, so with full disclosure of that. It's interesting. I'm not going to name who it is, but there's a C-level exec at one of these companies who's actually an investor in Spindle, and he said, "Antonio, this is great. I totally get it. We're never going to do it. So like we're going to make noises about crypto, but I think the Web3 paradigm is so different, right? Like it's not like I asked myself like the thought experiment: could I take Branch or AppsFlyer and like make it work for Axie or any other Web3 game? It's like you can pass custom events, you can pass custom user IDs. Well, why don't you just pass the wallet, right? And then try to like kludge in the wallet ID, but it's going to be it would be like double entry bookkeeping. You'd have to fire the attribution event every time you're actually writing on chain. Like, I don't know, you could probably get away with it for a while, but I think it would be very difficult. And I think where attribution is in Web2 right now, it's in a difficult spot, right? Their margins are fairly thin. It's very commoditized. They're all looking either for an exit, which I just sold to AppLovin, or they're doing something else. Branch, they're sort of getting into the ad space more directly. And so I just don't see them. It's like Google launching a social network, right? Which seemed terrifying at the time.
It's not their DNA.
But it's like you just can't. It's just not going to work. It's a bridge too far for them. So I don't really worry about that too much, to be honest.
Well, they're all moving into the space, but not necessarily from a product standpoint. And so, like, here's an anecdote to encapsulate what we're seeing. And I'm going to try to be vague here intentionally because we have to do a lot of business with these companies. One of the major measurement providers had a big announcement and new section on their website about attribution for Web3.
They like all this, but also this one.
One of the games that we work on that was working with this company said they reached out to them and were like, "Oh, we saw you guys announce that you're doing Web3 attribution. We want to learn more about what the new product is." Turns out there was no new product. It was just basically the thing they were already doing, but they're just putting a wrapping paper on it and saying, "Yeah, you can use this for Web3." So that's kind of the state of things. It's more marketing pivots and not necessarily that there's any meaningful product development I've seen from the existing players so far.
Yeah, I just don't buy it. Again, I've worked at one of these companies, which I still think very highly of, to be clear. I'm not digging the companies, but now that I'm kind of gone crypto native and actively building in the space, it is so different when it comes down. At a high level, it's conceptually similar. At the low level, it is completely different. And I don't see them making the jump at all.
Well, yeah, and I think the point you made earlier about just how like there's issues with the Web2 ecosystem, which is that we just have behemoths sucking all the money out of it. And so like that's everyone's margin. I mean, I feel like half the people in Web3, the reason they're in Web3 is just because they want to screw with the big companies. I mean,
oh yeah, no, totally. I want to create an ad system in which my esteemed former employers like Facebook and Twitter and whatnot cannot operate, right? And like Facebook has basically 100% take rate on your content, right? If you think a little bit bigger, if we really like think visionary, like how's marketing going to work with Web3 in a bigger picture? Like assume you have an attribution layer like Spindle, right? What do you do after that? Well, you can make the ads by be a smart contract, or you can have an affiliate program where if you drive a conversion with the Spindle link, for example, that drives an on-chain action, you get automatically paid in a wallet, right? You can imagine a publisher ad network where you run the ad and their Ethereum wallet just gets paid, assuming you actually drive the downstream conversion. You can drive a lot. You can start imagining a lot of the paradigms that exist in Web2, but in fundamentally different ways. You don't have a Google or a Facebook sitting in the middle of it, literally taking the lion's share of the revenue. It gets pushed to the edges, and there's a lot more control and there's a lot more autonomy. You can do a lot more things, right, with the blockchain.
Antonio, is that part of what drove you to make your next big, initiative in life in the Web3 space? Like I was watching an interview you did with Jason Calacanis like way back, and at the time you were promoting your book, and you mentioned something, paraphrasing, but oh yeah, I've basically burnt all my bridges in this industry. I'll never work in this space again. I'm obviously like history didn't pan out that way, but I'm just curious if your past experiences with some of FANG and large traditional tech companies at least motivated you to move into the Web3 space.
It's not really the past experiences. I mean, that was probably an early podcast. Like I wrote Chaos Monkeys actually from Europe because I thought, the book at the time, no one had really written an insider kind of tell-all memoir. I don't like the term tell-all because it's as if like I'm a whistleblower and there's no fraud there. I'm not really blowing a whistle. It's just like this is really how the sausage is made. And at the time, I think that was kind of a radical thing. Dude, nowadays, everyone builds out in the open. You've got public CEOs like Elon, like tweeting random stuff.
Right.
Like the level of, which I think is an improvement, by the level of disclosure and openness now is a lot higher than even as little as, a few years ago in 2016. So I just thought that like talking about how things work, and frankly, the book isn't that unflattering to Facebook at the end of the day. And so, that hasn't been my experience in that industry. Obviously, I went back to the industry after the book. Right. So no, but I wouldn't say it's resentment, but I do think we've reached a point of like technological stagnation, to be blunt, where I think you could build a lot of new cool stuff, and somehow we're stuck in these ruts, and things just don't feel as exciting. Again, maybe it's a midlife crisis, but things just don't feel as exciting as they did 10, 15 years ago when I was like bouncing around South Park and Soma, and you had basically every consumer internet company in their nascent stages, Airbnb, Uber, Pinterest, like they were all there, and everyone was kind of making it up as it went along, and no one knew how this would end up, but it was clear you were on the cusp of something big, right? Like shit was going on. And like, I just don't feel that way in Web2 anymore. And I do in Web3. So
I completely identify with that. I mean, I've been launching games for a while, and definitely was hitting like the burnout phase with just kind of launching very similar mobile free-to-play games. And like once I started playing some of these Web3 games and started building one with some friends, it was like I'm just like running off adrenaline. It feels like all day, every day, because it just feels like a fresh playground, and it's just like, oh, now we can do this. Now we can do this. It's like you got new Legos, and it reinvents the medium in a way that's really cool from a game design perspective.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so with the caveat that we might get in trouble for this segment, I do have a question I want your thoughts about. So I've been sort of calling this not like a decentralization. People are like, oh, Web3, it's decentralization. It really seems more like a re-centralization. And specifically, it looks like someone like A16Z are putting in basically, funding A16Z and Animoca Brands. There's like a few of these guys who are basically funding the entire thing. What do you think there is an issue with that in terms of the fact that, I mean, I think A16Z specifically is an interesting one because they've been in the valley for a long time. Is there an issue that all these companies are taking so much of that money, and then basically the folks from Web2 are funding the majority of the Web3 operations? Do you see that what do you think of the downstream impacts of that sort of money cannon? Is there one? Is something we have to worry about at all, or do we just not think about it?
Well, I mean, I'd say, first of all, do you even agree with that statement, Antonio, that the bulk of funding is coming from like traditional VCs?
I don't think it is, right? Because like when I look at my cap table, admittedly a seed round, so it's not the biggest cap table in the world or anything. A lot of the names are ones that probably don't ring bells to Web2 people. I mean, Dragonfly Capital, who led the round, or even Chapter One, which was kind of more of a Web2 consumer thing and is now investing in crypto, right? Like these aren't, I mean, in many ways, when I was raising my round, I'm not going to name names, but a lot of the big names of Web2, to be blunt, aren't big in crypto. And like people look at you askance if you were to raise from them. They all claim to have like a crypto practice because they kind of, but really they're not really players in the space. And I think you have a new set of players that are actually way more important. And then the other thing I would also disagree with, like, I don't agree with the premise that Web3 is being funded by Web2, but obviously in some cases it is. A16Z is real, and then
they're like Sequoia is like one of the largest investors in Polygon.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Again, in the case of A16Z, I think there you have people like Chris Dixon have been very visionary and have been calling this for like years. Right. And so even though they were deeply embedded in Web2 space, they're not like Web2. Like I don't know if this is a very kind characterization. There's definitely a notion of like a Web2 boomer, right? Someone who grew up within the paradigms of Web2, like they've done well for themselves. You can probably guess who some of these people are. And it's like, they don't want to see it like, oh, why does this need to be improved? And it's like, the mental flip they don't realize is that they've become the thing that they used to like build against when they were in their 20s, right? And they think they're in the same role in life. It's like, no, you're now in a different role in life. You're kind of like the hater and the kind of older, happy with the status quo person who doesn't want to change things anymore. And I think, look, I'm one of these people myself, right? I was not a crypto native, right? I'm not 19, and this is the entire experience of tech, but I see it for what it is. I believe in the vision, and you can switch and convert. And I think definitely in the case of A16Z and a few other VCs, you do see that the switch is flipped. They're not Web2 boomers kind of like kicking around in Web3. They're embracing the
They're very into it. Yeah.
Well, so
but I guess the other, so like forget about the Web2 people. I mean, it's clear that there are a handful of folks who are funding the vast majority of the Web3 ecosystem. And in that regard, it sort of is a re-centralization, because at the end of the day, the money is what you're accountable to where the money comes from, whether or not we want to
sort of, right? But But one of the weird things about Web3 is, right, that a lot of the liquidity comes very early on, which potentially is problematic, by the way, and leads to things like Ponzi's.
Mhm.
But you have access to liquidity a lot earlier than you used to, right? And like
Sure.
we raised, and I'm sure you're familiar, a lot of these companies raise with a token side note to the actual raise, which means that at some point that the value might actually not be encapsulated in the equity, it might be in the token, right? And so like if you think about who's floating Web3, is it just VC money?
No, it's not.
It's not. It's a lot of retail, which again, good and bad to that, but it's very different, right? While in the Web2 world, like only I think this Q1 of this year, Uber turned a profit for the first time, right? It's been what, 12 years since it got founded? Well, who's been floating this company the entire time? Venture capital, private equity, private investment. That's so I would say, if anything, Web2 world is way more dominated by VCs.
No, it certainly is. I'm not saying it is. I'm just the question is more around, is there an issue? Is that something that we're just a cycle we're doomed to repeat? And I think the comment you made was basically like, well, we're a little more hedged in this case, right? At least a huge portion of it comes from the consumers, which is good in a lot of ways. Although a lot of consumers are losing their shirts, I'd rather have the VCs lose their shirts. But yeah,
I'd like to add a little nuance here of just sort of like what I've seen in the trenches with like teams that I've been helping with fundraising, which is, some of this echoes what Antonio said, but I think it's a kind of a specific trend, which is earlier on in a life cycle. I don't think we're seeing the Web2 titans, playing a role in the games, in the tech. I think it's these crypto native funds that are much more in the weeds, born from the space. And then I think as products mature, something like Polygon, that's like a clear leader. So I think that's the trend I've generally seen, is like earlier stage, it's Web3 native investors. But as products mature and become clear market leaders, become the Axies of the world, the Polygons of the world, that's when I'm seeing more traditional players jumping in. So I think the truth is kind of somewhere in between. They're not taking the riskiest bets.
Well, that's that's a fine life cycle, because what that allows for is people who are really in tune with Web3 space or Web3 natives to make some money off that early investment. Right. And that's fine. And it's more like, I'm not saying that like Web3 is owned by Sequoia. I'm saying, like, is this something that we should talk about? Because
it's a potential threat. It's something that could happen, right?
Well, because people just don't really talk about the fact that there is so much VC money. I mean, they do, but like, just we're bleary eyed about the fact that there's a lot of the same folks who have transitioned. I mean, and we talked about at the beginning. I mean, it's a boon and it's a curse. I mean, we got the brain drain from the Web3 ecosystem into the Web2 ecosystem into the Web3 ecosystem, which is a positive thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the brain drain, I mean, obviously it's self-flattering, but I think, Web3 is fascinating. They have lots of really innovative, cool people doing, whose minds are totally in this totally novel way of looking at the world. But I do think a little bit of the business maturity, like the best part of Web2, like, again, you should know what your CACs are. You can't run a business without knowing what your CACs are, right? Like, ideally, in this ideal world, the Web2 like graybeards like Warren and myself here would bring some of our knowledge from Web2 and make it such that like Web3 doesn't have to speed run all the stupidity that we had to run through in the Web2 side, and just get to so like recently, you can probably guess who it is. I saw like the pitch deck for like a nascent Web3 ad network. So it's one of the Web3 publishers that you can probably guess, because there's only like 3 of them. And I saw the deck and it's like, oh my God, this shit is like ad tech circa 2005. It's like CPM. It's literally on a day basis. Yeah. It's like Yahoo Autos in like 2006. It's like, no. We cannot redo this. This is not where we start. We have to start like with an actual CPA ad network, with an actual goal in mind, with actual optimism. Like we can't do this again for the 3rd time. So, right.
Well, that kind of ties back to the first thing we talked about today, which was Apple policy, which, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, like by default, companies are going to try to apply their existing playbook to Web3. I think ultimately, founders such as yourself that are taking a step back and approaching this from first principles of like, let's just look at what this is and what's the optimal, not how did I do things at my last job, but like, what's the optimal solution for the space, recognizing its unique traits.
Yeah. No, and again, it is unique, right? It's weird that like, I can talk about ad tech all day, Warren, if you want me to, but it's weird that like, the pitch deck that I saw was like selling ads CPM. When's the last time you saw ads quoted CPM, right? It's not even CPM. It was by block of time. It was like, oh, for this day, right? We can't even count the impressions. So we're just going to like literally run the cron job at midnight or something, right? And it's like, that And then, coming from a world in which you can say, oh, I literally want to drive this downstream action. I'm willing to pay this much. And you know what? I don't care how it happens. Make it happen. And everything just kind of flows and it works. And sure, there's a little bit of fraud. There's a little bit of bumpiness here and there. But by and large, it is just a fundamentally different world than the world that we probably started slinging ads in 10, 15 years ago. And like, I'd love it for Web3 to just like get to that point. In the same way that some developing countries are actually more advanced mobile technology than we do, because they didn't pass through the landline phase. It's like, you don't want to have to get like landlines and then Blackberries and then iPhones. Just go to the iPhone stage, right? If you're importing iPhones. And so that's basically why I created Spindle. It's like, let's just go to the iPhone era for Web3 and like skip all the crap that came before.
Awesome. That was a great way to wrap the section. That's a good soundbite. Awesome. Well, we'll go to our last section, which is app of the week. We'll start with Warren. Warren, do you have an app this week?
Yeah, I'll go super quick. My app of the week is a Web3 game I've been looking to play for a while and just got access to. It's called Big Time. Listeners may have heard of it. It's one of, I'd say, the more hyped, higher production value games. The founder of this company was one of the co-founders of Decentraland. So I just started playing it. It's TLDR, it's like a World of Warcraft style game with a sci-fi time traveling bent. And cel-shaded graphics, really pretty game. Just started playing it, not super deep yet. It looks like, initially that it's going to be one of the early forerunners as far as like the quality bar that Web3 games are able to hit, but a little too soon to say like final verdict on it. So that's what I've been diving into this week, and we'll be going a lot deeper into it. It seems like it's got a pretty complex ecosystem and gameplay loops.
Cool. Antonio, do you have an app this week?
I definitely have an app that I really like. And again, full disclosure, I'm like a tiny investor in it. So I'm like, again, talking my bags. Right. But tiny investor, it's super cool. It's called Farcaster. You can find it at farcaster.xyz. It's a rather minimalist website and it's still in a closed alpha, but they just raised a big round from A6 and Z. Speaking of which, one of the founders, or both founders actually, are former early Coinbase. And basically imagine you took Twitter and you rebuilt it on like fully Web3 blockchain lines. What would that look like? And that's what they've built. And if you use the app, it's going to look remarkably like Twitter initially. But then when you start realizing it's like, oh, wait, like there's all these other apps. There's this thing called Searchcaster. That's the search engine on top of it. There's like Placecaster. So there's like a geo element. Like tonight, I'm actually going to like a meetup that was like place casted on the network. So basically imagine you actually like whatever Jack Dorsey's vision for like a fully blockchainified Twitter would be that he never implemented for X, Y, and Z reason. Like that actually is what Farcaster is. And it's super cool. And the best thing about it right now, obviously, is the community. It's like a lot of early adopter crypto people. It's basically the circle of Coinbase people plus the investors plus everybody else. And so it's a really kind of interesting, intimate community. Like I'm going to the meetup because the users on it are so cool. And I just, it's something about it. Like I've been asking myself the questions like for so long. It's like, why isn't there Web3 social media, right? Because it seems like in many cases it's an obvious fit. And yeah, there's a bunch of speculation as to why there is or there isn't. But the fact that someone's actually trying to create it, I think is really cool. So I have to say I use it pretty often, actually.
Awesome. That's a good one. I've heard about that, but that gave me a lot more context. Definitely want to dive in. Xander, you better have a good app this week. Your last few ones have been super weak. It's going to be like Clock or something this week.
My app is really, really bad this week. So it's always, I'm out of apps, Antonio. So my app this week is Stumble Guy, which is a mobile game that was acquired by who at Scopely, a giant company. I want to see what they're paying $1 bajillion for. So I boot it up. Very simple game, very simple gameplay, but you can tell it has like a little crack loop that's going to do really, really well in free to play. So not particularly exciting game, but interesting little one from that Scopely acquired last week. Awesome. We're out of time. Antonio, thank you so much for joining us. Very interesting conversation. I wish we could do another hour on analytics Web3. I think there's still a lot of stuff that we didn't really get a chance to touch on, but I would love to. If I'm sure plenty of people get a hold of you, but if you want someone to get a hold of you or learn more about Spindle or your topics, how can they do that?
Yeah, I'm unfortunately still pretty active on Twitter. So Antonio GM on Twitter. I have a Substack at thepullrequest.com. You can email me too if you're interested in the tool, Antonio@spindle.xyz, or just go to Spindle without the E.xyz as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Warren, take us out.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining, Antonio. This was definitely most of the fun, one of the most fun episodes we got to do because we both got to do some shit talking and also get really into the weeds, which are two of our favorite things to do. Cool. So as always, the podcast is brought to you by the folks at Upptic. Here at Upptic, we do all things to help games grow with a big focus on Web3, which is why we like talking to people like Antonio. So we both do all of the services work of creating the ads, building out the growth marketing strategy, executing on that. But we also have our platform, which is like a centralized hub for analytics and predictive modeling around all of your growth marketing and managing your creative workflows. So if any of that stuff sounds interesting, if you need a bolt-on growth marketing org of people and tools, reach out to us at Upptic. That's upptic.com.
Talk soon.